I'd like to first of all welcome all of you to Constitution Day 2017. My name is Rafael Fierro. I teach history and government here at Tunxis, for those of you who don't know me. I'm also the director of the Civic Engagement Institute. I'll have more on that in a minute. When an event like this happens, a lot of people need to be thanked. I'd like to begin by thanking the audience for being here. Not only for being here, but for also your active participation. We will allow plenty of time for your questions and comments, and so I'd like you to be a central part of the discussion. I'd also like to thank media specialist Mike Zitch. He's podcasting the event, which will be on the Tunxis website shortly, within a few days maybe. Brian Bonina is a graphic design expert here at Tunxis. You may have seen posters like the one pictured here. He drew that up, and he's always been an invaluable help to us. We have food here. I hope you've helped yourselves. If not, after the program, maybe you can get some food. But Rosalie Pion is our administrative assistant. She helped get us the food. The Student Government Association has funded the Civic Engagement Institute and has paid for that in effect. So we have the SGA to thank as well. Of course, I'd like to thank our panelists as well. There are 5 of them. There's 1 professor and 4 students, Professor Bob Brown, Ian Hughes. Well, let me go in order. James Robinson, Nora Pascoe, Lauren Shine, and Ian Hughes. All students here, they've been here various amounts of time, and they remember 9/11, some more than others. And so they'll lend their perspective and their personal experiences on the event, along with how their perceptions of the terrorist attacks have changed over time. Now, I had planned to join the panelists and offer my remarks on 9/11, but I think I'm going to just fold my remarks into whatever questions and comments you might have at the back end of the session, rather than saying what I want to say up front. In the meantime, I'd like to take the time to place this event in a broader context. As I mentioned, this event is sponsored by the Civic Engagement Institute. It's a newly created organization that is devoted to making our students more civic-minded, not only to enrich themselves, but also to help give them the tools they need to make their communities better. As the director of the Institute, one of my goals is to make our students see virtually all the activities they do on this campus through the prism of civic engagement. Now, this is especially important, I think, at this important time in our history. Okay? The country yearns for a new generation of leaders to carry on the noble experiment begun by the very founding fathers who make events like these possible. The Institute is a new organization, but we're off to a fast start thanks to Mohammed Kadir. He's assisting me. Ali, what's your last name? Gentile, that's right. So there are lots of people acting behind the scenes to make this possible, including many faculty and staff, as well as students. The mission of the Institute is, in fact, intimately connected to the Constitution. Let me further explain that by asking a question. Now, I know that my U.S. Constitution students are here, so they might want to reply, but my question is, what do you consider the most important part of the Constitution? Just raise your hand if you have a statement to make on that. John?
Probably.
Okay, interesting. We the people. I didn't think I'd get that response right off the bat, but of course John is in my Constitution class. Most people might say freedom of speech and the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, but I agree with John. We the people is an extremely important part of the Constitution. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Founding Fathers placed those 3 words as the very first in the Constitution. There's an anecdote about Benjamin Franklin. Once they had crafted the Constitution, they stepped outside and they were greeted by a crowd of people, and one of the ladies in the crowd asked Ben Franklin, "What have you created?" And he said, "A republic if you can keep it." If you can keep it. Now, what does that mean? It means the founding fathers intended this nation to be a republic. That's why they begin the phrase with "we the people," not we the leaders, not I the king, we the people, begins the Constitution. Our nation requires the constant attention and devotion of all of its citizens. Otherwise, we won't keep the republic. So to me, the question is, can we keep this republic? Given our climate, our current political climate, are we in dire need of doing better as informed citizens? To me, that is what the Institute is all about, and that is why we put on these events. As for this event, it is called Constitution Day. September 17th is the official day of honor because that is when the framers, they signed the final draft of the Constitution way back in 1787. Since 9/11, the federal government has mandated that state schools honor the day with an event or activity of their choosing. We have decided at Tunxis to hold panel discussions. And they are always related to some matter of importance that's connected to the Constitution, to a constitutional question. Examples from the past include the Constitution and immigration, the Constitution and the war on terror, the Constitution and the war in Iraq. We've had a dozen of these over the last 12 years. This year, however, we thought we'd do something a little bit different, and that is to focus on 9/11 itself. 9/11 happened 16 years ago. Many of our students, including some on the panel, have no real distinct memory of that terrible day. And among many of us who do have a memory of that day, at least for those who did not lose loved ones on 9/11, the wounds of the terrorist attacks have given way to barely noticeable scars. A lot of time has passed. This provides us with an opportunity. It provides us with an opportunity to view 9/11 from a detached, distant, and even an historical lens. This, one hopes, can lead to a better understanding not only of this particular event, but to an understanding of who we are as a people. And with all this in mind, I turn it over to our panelists, starting with Professor Brown.
Thank you. First of all, this is working, right? You can hear me? Okay. First of all, I think that the Civic Engagement Institute is a powerful innovation. I think it has going to play an important part in the ongoing future of Connecticut, or of Tunxis. Okay, that's it. That's as loud as it gets. I look forward to seeing what is going to evolve under Raphael's leadership. I do have very specific memories of September 11th. I was working at Tunxis. I was at that time not on faculty. I taught a course every semester, but I was in academic administration. And I can remember being in my office and just about, shortly after the first plane hit, standing up to take a little walk. I had no idea what had happened. I walked down the hall from my office and I heard radios on and saw people crowded around a TV set that at that time was in the area outside the cafeteria. And I was stunned. I was amazed. And what I did is I watched for a while, and then I went outside and sat on a bench. And our president, Dr. Catherine Addy, walked past and said, I can't believe this. And I said, I can't either. I mean, this was unparalleled, unprecedented, an attack on the United States of this magnitude. In my memory, it is as significant as the other sort of dominant historical event, single event of my lifetime, the assassination of President John Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. They're both there. They're both etched. I will say my thinking about September 11th has not so much evolved as has been filled in a bit. And the attempt that I would make to tie this to the theme of Constitution Day is simply that there are constitutional issues involved, not so much in the attacks themselves, but in the aftermath of the attacks. And, I agree that we the people is probably the salient phrase, the phrase that resonates from the Constitution. I'd also point out that the Constitution is not a document that's filled with stirring rhetoric. It's a legal document. It identifies the responsibilities and powers of government. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, is about as inspirational as it gets. It lasts one paragraph, and then we go straight to Article 1, boom, the legislative branch of government. And it says what the legislature shall do, what the legislature will do, what the legislature is empowered to do. And it's very lawyer-like. It was basically, if it wasn't put together by lawyers, it was certainly shaped and formed by lawyers. And the framer, I think, who deserves most credit for the language of the Constitution is a lawyer, James Madison from Virginia. He was also a legislator in the fourth president of the United States. But I think that the principle that I find most important to me, enshrined in the Constitution, is a principle called habeas corpus. Habeas corpus, the Latin interpretation means show the body. If the police arrest you, if the authorities arrest you, if they hold you, they have to present you in court, tell you the charges against you, and let people see that you are there. They can't just throw you in jail. They can't just throw you behind bars. They can't hold you without giving a reason. And yet, that's exactly what happened in the aftermath of September 11th. We don't know exactly how many, but perhaps as many as 800 young Muslims, males, were arrested, detained, held in the southwestern Connecticut, New York City, and northern New Jersey areas simply because they were Muslim, male, and young. And they were held in detention for months, some of them for weeks. And I know that there was a panic at the time, and that panic is understandable, but these young men were being held without regard to what they had done. None of them had any involvement with September 11th, and yet they had to endure something that I think was clearly extra-constitutional. I would also say that the panic that ensued had ripple effects throughout the operation of American government. The passage of the USA Patriot Act, parts of which I think are blatantly violations of the Bill of Rights. The requirement at one point that libraries had to, if asked, tell law enforcement authorities and government what books people had checked out from the libraries, clearly extra-constitutional. I think that much of what happened in the aftermath of September 11th, embodied in the USA Patriot Act, was not constitutional. Now, that's a memory that I have too, but it's also, when I said I'm not sure that my perspective has changed, I would say it's been deepened, and that's probably the most significant way has been deepened. September 11th actually brought me to a renewed awareness of what the Constitution means and what it should mean. So, and I will be brief as well, so and pass it along to my fellow panelists to my left. Thank you.
Hi, I'm James Robinson. Can everybody hear me? Cool. I'm significantly, slightly kind of older than most of the people in the room. Not too many, but, most of you guys. So well, of course not,
Nobody's older than me, so.
But not by much, not by much. We're all very young people up here. So from my experience, I was just starting high school when 9/11 happened. I was sitting in class. I was actually sitting in sex ed class, and a number of teachers came into our room and they were crying. It was weird. It was the weirdest moment. I thought there was like a school shooting or something going on for sure. And they wheeled out a television into the front of the room, and we didn't see the first plane hit, but we did see the second plane hit. And they had us all watch it, and it was the most disturbing image ever because I didn't think it was possible. Growing up, my parents had always told me, God forbid anything ever went on. We had counter missiles to fire down missiles, and we had F-16s that patrolled the perimeter and would save the day, God forbid, and none of that happened. And I think before that moment, there was a very business as usual mentality that you saw in the media, for those who remember, and that was gone. Like, it was like that bubble had been cracked for a little bit, and you had reporters who were visibly upset, talking about these events. And everybody was really friendly. Most of us are from Connecticut, so we know people don't talk all that much at the gas station. And for the first 2-3 weeks, everybody was incredibly friendly. People had conversations with each other. Everybody spoke to each other. And then I'd say if you went out about a year later, not even a year later, 6 months later, it gave rise to this hyper-patriotism. And everybody was really pro-America. And I thought it was necessary. I think everybody thought it was necessary at the time to just try to reaffirm how much we love this country because we'd been attacked. But what followed was scary, and that's the xenophobia towards Muslims and people who may not even be Muslim. And I don't think that sentiment has gone away anytime soon. I think that, in our rhetoric and in our behavior, towards people and our current immigration laws, you'll find that despite the fact that it was 15 years ago, a lot of that still resonates in the way that we pass laws and the people that we vote for today. It upset me a great deal. It still does at the time, having been there. I personally didn't lose anybody, but I do remember that day, and I do have friends who did lose people. I don't want to have too much overlap about the Patriot Act, but I will say that the word Department of Homeland Security didn't exist for me growing up. That wasn't a thing. We all had separate organizations, and they all protected us as best they could, I feel. And I don't think that we are any more safe than we were 15 years ago as a result of everything that we've passed. Again, I don't want to have too much overlap, but I personally don't think that we're any safer. Sorry about that. I'm gonna pass it off to Nora, sorry.
Hi, my name is Nora Pascoe. I was in high school also. I was in my senior year of high school. I was 19 years old. And I remember first learning about it as I was just coming out of my gym class in the morning. The second plane had just hit minutes before. And some boys came by in the hall, and they're going, oh, we're in high school. Oh, this World Trade Center just got attacked. It's all on fire. I didn't know what the World Trade Center looked like. I wasn't sure which buildings those were, but I got that it was a big deal. And on the way up to my second class, my resource class, all the TVs were on in every single room. We had TVs in our classrooms. And we could see the buildings burning. And I recognized the buildings then. And the fires were just so huge. We were so taken aback, I think, by the size of everything and by how crazy it was that this was happening. It was so unusual that it was hard to process that there were people inside those buildings burning. I didn't get that. I didn't understand that. And I went to my resource class, and my teacher in that class, I'm very close to still. We were very close. And so we're all talking about, oh my God, this is crazy. I can't believe this is happening. There's no TV in that class, and we didn't have smartphones back then. So we didn't know what was going on. And she said, stop talking about this. My brother's in the city. He's at a trade show right now, and I don't know what's up with him, and you guys need to just calm down. So we're trying to keep calm, and she gets a call from her mother saying that her brother was on the 101st floor of the South Tower. And she's just collapses in the class. We were all really close to her. She was a great teacher. And it was just this moment of sudden realization of how personal this was. It wasn't just some sort of crazy event. There were people dying, and we knew someone who knew someone. So she leaves the class, and we got ushered across to the next class. The teacher there was watching us. And a minute before that class was dismissed, we watched the South Tower fall. And we knew her brother was inside. And it was just a sense of like, oh my God, helplessness. And it's just not, it was just unbelievable. And the rest of the day was kind of a blur until I was dismissed from school. And it was such a beautiful day outside. I remember how blue and still the sky was, and just the birds singing. And I waited on the porch. I forgot my key. I waited for my mom to come home and let me in. And it was just so surreal, just seeing how beautiful everything was. When a state over, we had seen all this chaos taking place and buildings falling and the sky full of ash. And when my mom got home and I told her, we went inside, we turned on the TV, and it was just playing on loop over and over. The planes crashing into the building, the towers falling every single time, over and over. And every time we were thinking, maybe it'll be different, just hoping maybe it would be different. And I can't remember a time in my life where I cried so hard or where I prayed more, because I was really religious back then. And I remember praying, like being down on my knees, just like, God, please take this back. Please undo this. And that didn't happen. And I remember afterwards, the days, it was kind of like that day was really, really hard, but the days following were almost harder because it was really quick that like our grief and everything was just sort of harnessed into this, like we have to rally around this flag, which suddenly showed up on everybody's car and everybody's antenna, and that was not how it used to be. And I felt like, not only was the music censored on the radio, because it was, and just everything, the civil liberties were censored. Our grief was censored. We had to grieve a certain way or we were viewed as unpatriotic. And I remember being at a peace vigil in Hartford a couple weeks after the attacks, and this car driving by with a big American flag on it. This guy screams out the window of the car, "Why don't you all clean up the dead bodies in New York?" Because the pain, and it was so raw and so visceral for everyone. It wasn't just us feeling this grief and not wanting more people to die, not wanting our friends to be deployed. It was other people feeling like, no, we need to send people over. And you couldn't blame them. It was just this like helplessness though. Like why can't I be grieving the way I need to grieve and still be a patriot? And I remember there was a concert, a Tribute to Heroes concert, and crying over that. And I remember just feeling this almost PTSD that was undiagnosed. I would see like rubble construction sites and near my house, and I would just be like, oh my God, I would just see September 11th all over again, see the rubble that had been on the ground. And I remember I took Irish dance out in Wethersfield, and there was an airport right near there. So every time there was this low-flying plane, which had happened anyway, like for 15 years when I was out there, we would freak out. Like all the students were like, oh my God, a low-flying plane. I don't know, it was just this like innate reaction then, because we're so full of fear. A bunch of the airlines actually closed down and went bankrupt because people were afraid to fly. And so it was a big deal for me. I was so distraught over it. I'm small. I'm like about 123 pounds right now. By the end of that year, I was 95 pounds. I was just devastated. It broke me. And I think now, because Professor Fierro wanted us to say like how it was then and how we've changed now in our perspective. I think back then it was such a personal grief for me that it was really hard for me to view how other people might see it globally or nationally. And now I can do that a little bit. I agree with James. I don't think we're safer. I agree with Bob Brown. I think that those rights that have been curtailed and have not come back, that's a real problem for us. But I see now more why people felt the need to do that. And I'm able to be up here on a panel and not be crying my eyes out, which is a huge improvement from God, it was like 6 years before I could even talk about 9/11 without just breaking down. I'm trying to think. Oh, also, the Berlin Fair. Okay, so the Berlin Fair, we all know in Connecticut, takes place in September, a couple weeks after September 11th. We're at the Berlin Fair, and there are these targets, the little game where you shoot the little frogs or whatever, and you win a prize. the frogs weren't the frogs. They were Osama bin Laden. All of them were Osama bin Laden. And if you shot Osama bin Laden, you would win a T-shirt with an eagle on it, because that's how quick people were to capitalize off our grief. And I remember these little snow globes in the commercial booths, and you turn them upside down, they have the towers in them. And you turn them right side up, and ash falls from the sky, and they say, "God bless America" on them. It was the tackiest thing. And then I remember the booth where the Freedom Prize, because France didn't support our war effort, were sold, suddenly caught fire. And firefighters were in that booth. That was like where the firefighters sold their fries, really good fries. And everybody started crying because it was a building on fire and there were firefighters, and it just flooded back to everyone. People were on their knees crying. It was this little fire, people put it out right away. But it was just, a completely different time in America. And it's hard to explain to anyone who doesn't remember, but I think it's good that we're having this panel. So I'm excited about the questions people will ask.
Hello. I'm Loren Shine, and probably one of the youngest on this panel. I was in kindergarten when this happened. My folks were actually afraid to take me, so I remember waking up and heading down to the basement, and I saw the second tower get crashed into, and my father was an insurance agent at the time. He sold computer software, and I lived in New Jersey then, so we were right near the New York State border. And one of his clients, Cantor Fitzgerald, was stationed at the World Trade Center. So my story is a bit of an almost, I guess, where I could have lost my father through this. I heard that he, fortunately, most of the people that he worked with survived, but I guess I sort of saw the effects after in the next couple of years. I remember my mom was a big fan of Bruce Springsteen, so The Rising came out. I do remember that. I was a huge fan of country, so I definitely saw the influx of music. I don't really remember quite as vividly as Nora does, because of the drastic age difference, but I remember in middle school, I had these two guys that were Muslim, and I just remember being afraid of them for no reason. And just this fear, this intolerance that was set into me at such a young age, and I wasn't even sure why. And I don't want anybody to experience that because of something that has happened that we're almost, it's almost 2 decades ago. I don't think that's not what America should be. We the people means everybody. It's not we the white people or the black people. It's everyone. Everyone should have equality, and I understand the fear, but I think patriotism should be for everyone.
Hello, my name is Ian Hughes, and I am in fact the youngest. I was 18 months old when 9/11 happened. I don't remember much. All I know is that I was at my grandparents' house sitting next to my grandfather, and he is from Brooklyn, and I remember just a face, just an image of his face being so horrified by what he was seeing on the TV. I obviously didn't really understand it. I didn't grasp what it meant, what I was looking at, but it was so life-altering for everyone that I realized it must have had some significance. And what I would later come to understand is that it did affect everyone somehow in some way, whether it was patriotism, whether it was racism, whether it was anything that could have altered their life, a loved one dying, something like that. What I remember most distinctly was the 5-year anniversary of when 9/11 happened. And I went with my dad, who was a firefighter, to a vigil for this first responders. And after in the car, he told me, "Do you know what the saddest sound on the planet is? It's the sound of bagpipes at a firefighter's funeral." And that was really horrifying to me. You know, I was 7, 8 years old, and that really struck me. Just the fact, the feeling, the emotion. I wasn't old enough to grasp the emotion at the time, but what I came to understand is that it was huge. The emotion hit me later on, you know, in like freshman year in high school when we watched footage of people jumping from the buildings. That's very horrifying. I mean, that's not something you're ever supposed to see. That's not something you were meant to have to watch. But it happened. It happened to those people, and it happened to people that loved them, and it happened to people that had to watch that were there, or that were first responders, that were newscasters. It's just something that nobody ever was supposed to live through, and it was never meant to happen. There were safety measures in place, not as strict as they were now, I know that, but it was never supposed to be this way. And it's just changed the face of government. It's changed patriotism as a whole. It created the war on terror, and it's not necessarily changed the country for the better.
Okay, well, I want to thank the panelists. I thought they were all very good and presented some very impassioned statements about 9/11. So if we can just give them a round of applause. We can open it up to the questions and comments of audience members now. I hope there are lots of them. We've got plenty of time. So I see at least a couple of hands up. Why don't we start with Daniel? I think your hand is up, and then William after that. Yeah, if you could stand as you.
Should I sit, stand, or
The standing is good.
Okay,
We can
awesome,
see.
works for me. First, just thank you all for taking the time to present. Thank you for Professor Fierro and Professor Brown for taking the time. Well, you got my point. But thank you all for being here. My question is, for those of you who remember 9/11, I'm sure you all may have noticed in the following years since September 11th that there has been a rise in nationalism and patriotism, not simply in news, but also in pop culture. I work at the AMC movie theater in Plainville, and I've noticed that every year on September 11th, we always carry a 9/11 related film, capitalizing off of the tragedy of 9/11. My question for you is, what is your opinions on the thought of pop culture profiting off of 9/11, and how does that make you feel? Just wondering.
I think pop culture has always profited off of tragedy.
Yeah.
Thanks. I think that pop culture has always profited off of tragedy. I'm a big comic book fan. I own a lot of very old comics, and I think even after World War II, you had like Batman beating up Hitler and stuff like that. Like that's always been the case. I think it's nothing about what's going on now is different. You'll hear a lot of people say that history repeats itself, but I recently learned that history actually rhymes. So, no, I don't think it's it's not a far cry from anything that we've seen before. If you look at history, something terrible happens, and then people who are interested in making money find a way to turn that into a source of income for themselves.
Yeah, I agree with James. It's not anything new. I think it was just how soon it happened that really bothered me, and the way, and I understand punching Hitler. I think that's a good thing. I think that'll always be a good thing in comics. But a snow globe that, where ashes fall from the sky. So I remember kids dressing up as Osama bin Laden, little, 8-year-old kids. People were selling costumes of Osama bin Laden because that was a scary thing. When people around here had lost people. Imagine a little 8-year-old kid showing up at your door when you just lost your brother or your sister. I just think it was just how soon it happened and the tacky way in which it occurred. Some of what you might call capitalism, the music, Some of it was beautiful. I don't really listen to a lot of country, but there was this Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning song. And I think that song, I don't care if you love country or not, I think if anyone listened to that song that remembers 9/11, that song will make you cry. Some of it was good. It really did bring out patriotism and help us express our grief and feel our grief. And that is important because we needed to process that. So.
Nora mentioned a song. I'm of a different generation, as I've made a point of saying earlier. The song that in pop culture that I most associate with 9/11 is actually a song by the Eagles, "A Hole in the Sky," "Hole in the World" rather. And I was very powerfully moved the first time I heard that. I think though, the thing that most interests me about is the way popular culture, I think as a result of September 11th, has come to infuse political public culture. I mean, you know, the interpretation of September 11th in popular culture very much shapes the political agenda today. It explains Donald Trump's election as president. And if there's no September 11th, there's no Trump presidency because he has no one to run against. He wasn't running against Hillary Clinton, though he said he was. He called her Crooked Hillary. He was running against the outsiders. And he calling for a ban on Muslims coming into the United States, which got modified when he became president because you can't just ban all Muslims. But I do think that what happened here is you see an event that gets interpreted in pop culture in a certain way. And more than anything I've seen in a long time, that interpretation in pop culture has come to shape the public perception of life in the United States and politics in the United States. So,
Bob's point, I just want to add that, first of all, it doesn't matter how old you are, you should like the Eagles because they're kind of timeless. Beyond that, I'm interested in the question as to what made Donald Trump. Lots of people like to see him as the beginning of a new kind of era based on intolerance and ultra-nationalism and all that, and that may be well and good, but I think it's important to realize that it doesn't begin with him. He's as much a symbol of our political culture today as he is a cause of it. And I do think the seeds of Donald Trump were sown in 9/11, although no one could have imagined Donald Trump running for president at that time, except for Donald Trump. I think since then, you know, once the fog of 9/11 had lifted, unity gave way to division, 2 wars, one in Iraq, one in Afghanistan, which bore tremendous financial cost, but also a cost to the unity of the country. Kind of tore us apart. It drained the U.S. economy of its resources, which kind of set in motion the recession of 2008, though there were other factors involved too, of course. And that recession took away jobs that never came back, which created a very angered blue-collar constituency that Trump later took advantage of and used to win the election of 2016. So I think there is a direct line from 9/11 to Donald Trump. We could explore that all year long, but I'm interested in that question. William, you had your hand up.
So I feel like there's a spectrum, right, between safety and freedom. Right? You can't have full safety and full freedom. You kind of have to. It's like a number line, right? One end is safety, the other end you get it, right? So for example, for me personally, I feel like I do value freedom over safety. Like freedom, I lean more towards the freedom side over the safety side, right? I still want some safety, a good bit of safety, as much safety as I can get, but I think that for me, it is more important to maintain you know, rights and liberties. I'm just curious on where you guys fall in that spectrum.
I would tend to agree. I believe that personal freedoms have been infringed upon for certain groups, especially because of 9/11, just because with unintended things such as like social discrimination towards Muslims and things like that. And then there's also things with the Patriot Act where people are just arrested on mere suspicion of even being involved with terror or a group, and not even necessarily provable at the time, but they've still been jailed, they've had their rights infringed upon. And I think that personal freedoms need to be protected a little more after all these events have taken place.
I will say that I do agree with minorities and the underdog being protected, but we also need to think about the extremist of freedoms and liberties, because that's how the Civil War started. We had the South talking about state rights. I think that we also need to just be mindful of just how far we're willing to go to protect our civil liberties and freedom, and make sure that we have a clear head when we're thinking about that.
I want to go back to the Constitution and the preamble of the Constitution to address William's point. And one of the more important, beyond we the people, one of the more important statements of the preamble is to secure the blessings of liberty. So security for liberty's sake. And so I don't know that those two things, security and liberty, should be incompatible. The government is put in place to protect our liberties, not necessarily first and foremost for our own physical protection, but to protect our liberties. In other words, the government should not create an environment in which our liberties are destroyed or threatened in any way. And I think what's happened since 9/11 is that we have gone down a path of misunderstanding that phrase, to secure the blessings of liberty. We've sacrificed a good deal of it, I think, at the expense of a physical security that, in a sense, undermines what this country was founded upon, right? Although I do think that, you know, the threats to freedom that we experience, some people make political hay of that, and I do think we still have a framework, a constitutional framework. I think the government did take advantage of the crisis created by 9/11 by, passing the Patriot Act and especially with ethnic groups who seem to be focused upon more than others. It perhaps crossed the line, but I think it leads to that phrase, to secure the blessings of liberty. In some sense, that's been undermined. That's me.
I think also.
I'm sorry, Nora. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go, please.
Okay. So, with the opening of the Department of Homeland Security, before, look, what happened was we were so focused on catching terrorists and having this department that would catch terrorists, but there weren't a whole ton of Muslim terrorists to catch. I mean, it wasn't so they had to find terrorists because they have all these people now that have all these jobs, and terrorism has been redefined. And now all of a sudden, and this did happen, there were people that were just sitting in trees because they didn't want trees to get cut down, and all of a sudden they were eco-terrorists and they were jailed for that. There were people who were peacefully protesting when we protested the war in Iraq who were jailed for that, for peaceful protests. They were just taken, and as Professor Brown said, we didn't have rights at that time. The habeas corpus was suspended. So I think that was a serious problem. I mean, you can say and safety is important, security is important, but it really needs to be defined, because it just got so out of control. I felt like, we didn't know who was going to be considered a terrorist, and you had to really be careful about what you did and what you said. Everyone was all of a sudden scared to to say things. I still don't know all this stuff. I just learned about this thing about people being arrested for sitting in trees. I was reading an article online the other night, and I'm like, that's crap. Because when I was growing up, there was this song, a children's song my mom used to sing to me, Hooray for the Lambeth Children. It was some kids who sat in a bunch of trees and kept them from being cut down. The cute children's song based on a true story. Those kids were terrorists. So.
Childhood eco-terrorism, I like that. There's a saying. I'm a member of the American Civil Liberties Union, so you get my perspective. But it comes from the ACLU. I can't remember who said it, but someone once said that those who would sacrifice liberty for security deserve neither. So, that's sort of my perspective. Yes, we need to be secure, but we need to be secure within the context of making sure that our liberties continue to exist. So.
Bethany and then Mohammed, and then we'll just work our way around. Quick question.
Yeah. Can somebody pass a mic to whoever's...
Absolutely. Can we pass this? Okay. Yes, it's important that we hear the questions.
Yeah, you may as well just.
Thank you. Just touching on what Will said, I think when you talk about security and liberty, you're looking at more of a scale and a balance than a spectrum. And going back to the preamble, along with securing the blessings of liberty, there's that line, ensure domestic tranquility. So these two things are presented in equal measure, and when they are observed and practiced in equal measure, things run pretty smoothly. And I think what you saw after 9/11 was this shift where that protection did become more important than personal liberties. And in my mind, I always sort of associate it with this societal or moral illness, right? Where we as a society developed this phobia, and our response to it was self-harmful, right? And we all know that this can happen with individuals, right? Where we all know that there are people who can damage themselves trying to protect against germs, right? Washing with bleach and still wool. And I think we almost see that happening on a societal level where we as individuals know that it's irrational, we know that it's wrong, and I think even we as a society understand that, but we haven't found the way to stop.
It's an interesting way of looking at it. I agree with that portion of the preamble that talks about domestic tranquility. I think what I want to say may contradict a little bit what I said earlier, but can we put ourselves in the position of the U.S. government for a minute? And not to give these government officials a free pass, because there is plenty to critique there. But at the same time, 2 points. Number one, obviously 9/11 was probably the most emotional event of our generation, right? Maybe in all of American history, for that matter. So government is made up of people like you and I, and they also were very emotional over what happened. And for them to overreach is not too surprising to me. The fact that we can't assign emotion to us when it comes to this event, but find government officials guilty of practicing that same emotion. Now, they're in positions of power, so what they do with that emotion matters more than what you and I do with it. I get that. But it's hardly surprising that government passed the Patriot Act, hardly surprising that the Department of Homeland Security was established. And that's not even to justify, it's just to explain it a little bit more, in more context. And the second point is that despite the many criticisms of the U.S. government that we've pointed out already, there's one event in history that compares, and that's the Pearl Harbor attack, which ultimately led to the internment of 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans. And we did no such thing after 9/11. And I think that is at least worth repeating, and it's worth making that point that in some sense, as unhappy as you and I may be about the Patriot Act and the Department of Homeland Security and the threat to our personal liberties that have clearly been in play since 9/11, that the U.S. government came nowhere near doing what it did to Japanese and Japanese Americans. And I think that's at least a point worth noting. I didn't mean to cause silence. Actually, just the opposite. I want to provoke discussion. Mohammed.
I just want to say, because Nora, you said something about Islam terrorists. Not everyone who's Muslim is a terrorist. But I just want to say, I'm speaking on some of Muslim people, but why does it have to be like, there has to be a word before terrorism? Because every person who blows up something doesn't have to have a name. There's no such thing as white terrorism, black terrorism, and like, you know what I mean? But why does it have to be Muslim terrorism? Because we don't know that the 9/11 specifically were Muslim.
Yes. I think I did state that incorrectly, and I am sorry. What I was trying to establish was the difference between terrorists that were focused on attacks like 9/11 versus eco-terrorists or protesters. But I do agree with you, and I am sorry. Not all terrorists like that were Muslim, and certainly not the majority of Muslims are terrorists. Absolutely. So I do apologize for that.
You want to say anything? You don't have to respond.
Oh no, it's just I like the way I didn't mean it like particularly personally or anything. I just wanted to say because like that what happened in 9/11 kind of shaped what today's people, because every time on the news it comes up, it feels like what happened during 9/11 is shaped what people see it. And how do you guys see it as like what's your point of view?
Well, I think when you raise an interesting secondary issue, which is language, the words that we use, and the phrase enters popular culture because it captures the attention of a certain population. And if you'll remember, during the closing days of the Obama administration, he was attacked by people on the right for refusing to use the phrase radical Islamic terrorist. And somehow or other there's a special value attached to that word radical. And Obama's point simply was there are terrorists of all stripes. And to call someone a terrorist, a Muslim a terrorist, is to simply say a Muslim terrorist is sufficient. But somehow or other there's a distinction between some terrorists and others who are radical. And that's because words have power and people listen to words. So I think that's at least a partial explanation for how certain concepts enter the language of popular culture and ultimately political culture. So.
I'll say that before that point, the words radical and extremist didn't exist. Nobody used those words. I remember I spent a large amount of time perplexed by the word insurgent. Like, what does an insurgent look like? We're over there fighting insurgents. What is an insurgent? Like, do insurgents have uniforms? Do they wave their hands and say, "Hi, I'm here to kill you"? Like, or "We did it." Do they have a sign? I think to partially answer your question, we had to assign blame to someone. People were outraged, and a lot of legislation that took place wasn't based on like cold, calculated logic, but fear. And we still operate in an environment of a very palpable fear, I feel. That's seen everywhere. I mentioned it before, but it affects, and Dr. Fierro did as well, but it affects the way that we vote, and who we vote for, and why we vote. And I don't think that fear is going to dissipate anytime soon. He had mentioned the attack on Pearl Harbor and the internment of Japanese people, but if you look at the first and second Red Scare, we looked at all Russians with suspicion for a long time. We still do, kind of. So I think it's just, we're very, I think that we think we're prepared, but as a people, ultimately, we're reactionary.
I would tend to agree with Professor Brown in that that language definitely does permeate into government and into legislation, where we have things like the Patriot Act, which was revised in, I believe, 2007. Section 802 was revised to include domestic terror. But the problem is that it wasn't any more specific. So, the creation of the term eco-terrorism is pretty laughable in the fact that that's not terrorism. It isn't. But the scary thing is that it can be subjective. The government can label terrorism as whatever it wants to be. And again, I agree with Dr. Brown that language has so much power and it needs to be considered more carefully.
Okay. So earlier you guys mentioned kind of like toxic patriotism, as we'll just call it now, and that kind of was demonstrated very clearly when the Bush torture memos came out and all that. There were people actually supporting torture. Like, we haven't had many times in this country where people are like, yeah, let's torture people. And we're starting to go down that path again, where we're letting the worst parts of our patriotism come out. And I press it again to turn it off.
I'm not sure. I've been talking about the way popular culture permeates political culture, but I think that an interesting example of it perhaps working the other way is the television show 24. Kiefer Sutherland tortured the hell out of people, and he did it without hesitation. And he did it in the name of finding the terrorists. And I think most of the evidence suggests that that torture is essentially counterproductive. It doesn't. If you get information, chances are it's false information provided so that they won't torture me anymore. But I think that we have become more tolerant. We absolutely have. We think in terms of extracting information as simply as possible, even if that is painful. So.
To avoid there being too much of an echo chamber, I'd like to counter that notion by saying that I grew up in a house with 4 brothers and 2 sisters. And I think those of us who come from large families, we know that if one person messes up, we punish everybody in the house. And I know it sounds terrible. It sounds terrible when talking about waterboarding or anything like that, but torture isn't necessarily to extract the information is ultimately irrelevant. It doesn't matter. We're going to find it some other way anyway. We torture people to deter behavior, because there's no other way to deter someone else's behavior, especially if they're doing it for God. Or we think they're doing it for God. We don't know why they're doing it. We really don't. But we torture people to deter behavior. We punish people. Corporal punishment exists to stop people doing horrible things. And I think at whatever point we find a solution other than that works, we'll move on to that. But so far that's been effective for the last couple centuries.
Just say one thing.
Sure.
I was just going to say, just like corporal punishment has not been proven to be a deterrent. I think that what the torture is about revenge, almost. Like the American psyche needed this revenge. Torture, capital punishment, none of that. It's been proven that it is not a deterrent for criminals. And actually the torture that we did, some of it was on innocent people. And the footage that we had and the photographs that we had of that were used as anti-American propaganda then for Al-Qaeda, still probably for ISIS. So I don't think that it was a good idea, really.
Oh, yeah. So, to what you were saying, James, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to mess that up. So I was talking about how culture itself there were actually people in favor of torture. Like, there were people defending the use of it for no reason. There were people just doing it.
I don't think it was for no reason. I think that
there were people who didn't even read any of the documents, who didn't look at anything, didn't even think about it, and their first instinction was just to defend it.
Oh, sure. I think that you'll find that many of us are guilty of groupthink at one point or another. regardless of what the topic is. Unfortunately, this topic was torture. I'm not advocating torture. I'm saying I believe this exists. For clarification, just so you guys don't think I sit around torturing things.
Just to add to that point, I know that it's easy to fault the government for these things, but in a democracy, in a democratic republic, the decisions that are made are often made not in contradiction to what the American people think, but in accordance to what the American people think. And I think you have a number of Americans, and I'm not pinpointing section or region of country or class or race, but a number of Americans are perfectly fine with torture. And you've seen recently Donald Trump play to that. And so we always have to take into account the fact that our government, in some sense, is a manifestation of its people, of our country. And I think that many of us have a hard time reconciling that with the way they would wish this government were to act. And so it's easier to blame the government than to blame people and their attitudes, and even more difficult to change people's minds about things like torture and whether it's a good idea or not. It's hard to persuade people. I think that's what we ought to be in the business of doing. Okay, lots of hands are up. Kayla, go ahead.
This question's for the two youngest panelists. You grew up, and I grew up, with the nationalism, the xenophobia, the hyper-militarism that rushed into American culture after the 9/11 attacks. But it wasn't always like that. And so how did you feel when 9/11 conceived a different America?
I think that I was very guilty of the whole groupthink mentality. My family is Jewish, and it was really the first time I actually heard my grandfather, who was a history teacher, talk about Muslims in this way that just seemed completely intolerant and kind of contradictory, since one of his favorite subjects was World War II. So I just remember being just scared and baffled and just very, very confused.
What I would say I remember most is a conversation I had with my mom when I was maybe 11 or 12 years old, and we were walking through Grand Central Station in New York, and there were two National Guard service members standing with assault rifles just inside the terminal, just looking around, as they do these days. And I asked her, I said, what are they here for? And she said, just for safety, because terrorism still existed, even though it wasn't necessarily, 10 years after, it wasn't necessarily so pertinent, but it was still scary. It was still a possible reality. And I think that is what we grew up with, is that just the fear. We didn't necessarily see the change, but we saw the fear still lingering.
Just one quick point. I know we have other questions, but that xenophobia, that ultra-nationalism that happened in the wake of 9/11 and continues and maybe even has accelerated in recent years. It's part of a cycle of American history. There are ebbs and flows of this kind of thinking that go back to the nation's founding. And it seems like history does repeat itself in that way once every 20, 30 years or so. And according to reports by the FBI and others, these instances of xenophobia have been alive and well since about 2005, and they've been climbing ever since. But you can go back to the 1950s and get that same sense. There was a consensus in this country among Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, that there was a very strict definition of what it meant to be American back then. This is in response to the Cold War and to the Russians. And in the 1920s, we saw the same thing with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which had as many as 5 to 8 million members in the 20s. The rise of religious fundamentalism was part of that period of time too. So it's interesting how once every 30 years or so, these kinds of attitudes, they don't emerge out of nothing, but they do rise to the surface. So it's an interesting commentary on American history. I want to give people a chance who have not spoken. Yes, this young lady. Mm-hmm.
Here it comes.
Awesome, thank you. All right, my name is Faith. I had a question that's related to both what you just said and what Loren said mainly. It seems like we've gone from being a culture of fear back in like 2000, whatever, 2000, to actually being like a blatant culture of violence. And it kind of scaled back now with, from what I've read, like mostly like Jewish people and stuff like that tend to associate what's going on now with more like World War II. And everybody else, like when, what's his face, got punched, Richard Spencer, when he got punched, everybody on the left thought that was excellent. And they like, well, okay, not everybody, but a ton of people condone it. And now there are a lot of people are saying, yeah, punch Nazis. And yeah, violent protest because no one else is going to listen to you otherwise. And I don't think that would have existed if we didn't have stuff like what we had in 2020. Because I don't get the feeling that that was really the case with the Red Scare. Like, that was more of a silencing thing than a let's kill those Reds in America thing.
Well, they killed him judicially. The Rosenbergs were executed. But beyond that, I think that Faith raises an interesting point. And as someone who went to the University of Virginia, graduated from it, I was horrified by what happened in Charlottesville. But I certainly don't condone punching people in the face because I object to what they're doing. I do believe that protests can be messy. And I believe that any time protest gets messy, there's the possibility that something unpleasant can emerge. That's just in the nature of protest. It's awfully hard to maintain civility when two groups with such diametrically opposing views are face to face to each other. So it's sort of an inevitable outcome when you get strongly held and opposite passions in the same place. So.
I've just been so struck by the level of hypocrisy that exists in American politics these days, and I think social media has just exacerbated that. What Faith mentioned as, yeah, punch Nazis, that's acceptable on the left, you know, and if you can have an equally riled up crowd on the right saying, yeah, punch those eco-terrorists, and everyone's okay with that on one side but not the other. And social media, to me, it forces people to go into their respective corners, and no matter what happens is okay. If it happens on your side, and if it happens on the other side, it's completely unacceptable. People feel a selective sense of outrage, and I think we should strive for more consistency. If violence is wrong, it's violent. It's wrong on all sides. As far as Nazis go, you know, I think we've come to a place in our society where the vast majority of people have rejected Nazi values, and those who do exist, I don't think punching them is the right thing, but we need to continue persuading people and using the force of our reason rather than the force of our punches to keep sending messages across of tolerance. But I think a little bit more consistency would be helpful on all sides. Sure.
So up here, other than James, we're all white. None of us are Muslim. And the events in Charlottesville, I know it's kind of a digression, but it does, it does tie into the fear in our society and the violence, and that violence has taken place against Muslims as well since 9/11. I don't think that any of us, white people at least, can make that judgment call, because when people's lives are threatened, when the events in Charlottesville, when Nazis are rushing towards people, and white supremacists, which we need to also acknowledge, because white supremacy is a homegrown problem. Nazis are kind of like, oh, Nazis are bad, everyone can agree that's a foreign thing. We really do need to focus on white supremacy, which is a big problem in our country. And when a white supremacist is running at you with a torch and like gonna hit you or something, you're gonna be violent. Your life is at stake, and your life is at stake every day. I don't know how you feel, and I don't want to just speak for you, but black men, you're walking down the street at night, your life is in danger. So as white people, we can't say no, we shouldn't be violent. These people, white supremacists, Nazis, they are a huge threat of violence. They are advocating for genocide. When we had the protests in Boston, and we're saying like, oh yeah, these Boston people, they drove the Nazis out or whatever. It was the African Americans who were on the front lines. It was the white people who stood back and said, oh, yay, or whatever. Black people were arrested. We can't make that call. We're too privileged to make that call, in my opinion.
I'm, again, not going to try to reinforce any sort of guilt on anybody, because that's not my position. But I will say that too many things intersect with politics, all right? And I think that when talking about white nationalists or Nazis or whatever you want to call them, thank you, rebranding, it's entirely different than any other. You can have a differing political view, but I don't think you can advocate genocide. And I'm just supposed, it's not, while it might be for the majority of the people in the room some benign thing, it's like a real fear for me. Like that somebody's gonna hurt me or hurt my cousin or hurt my brother or hurt my uncles or hurt my dad or hurt any of my friends because I look different. And that's not a different political view. That's people don't want, you know what I mean? They don't want to coexist. I don't know how you're supposed to allow something to grow and metastasize, knowing that they're just gonna gather more people to follow their ideology for whatever reason they've picked today. So I'm not saying it's okay to punch Nazis, but I don't know what the solution is. I think that we need to reassess what hate speech is and where it fits in free speech.
Okay, we're just about out of time. I almost hate to leave it on that note, because we've come such a long way in this discussion. Bethany, go ahead, very quickly.
I think for me, what I'm seeing now in terms of then to now is a societal grief. And, we all lost something that day. And some people on an individual level, they lost loved ones, they lost people they cared about. But as a country, we lost that illusion of security that we had. James, you mentioned that specifically. And we saw the country go through its stage of denial with its overt patriotism, its flags everywhere, it's America's the best and we all love each other and everything's okay. And then we saw the country go through its period of anger where we were torturing people and we were rounding up Muslims and we were locking them away from the public eye, and we were passing the Patriot Act and we were doing everything we could to punish and to get that revenge, right? And I think since then we've been stuck in this bargaining stage where we're trying to get that semblance of security back. And we're doing all of these things just to feel safe. and it's not working. And hopefully, at some point, we will reach that acceptance place where we realize that security is not one of those things that is guaranteed. It is one of those things that is always going to be at stake. It's always going to be protected at best.
Okay, wise words, and I think we'll end with those words. Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you for being here, all of you. I think we all did a great job, and we should applaud ourselves. Nice job.